dox you on War Thunder.
Dude, two more leaks, man. Dude,
I was going to say, was one of them
at
an
least,
F-16? I think.
dude, I swear to God, in fairness, the F-16 one wasn't really a leak so much as like you can't post this online, it's not allowed.
Yes.
Like it is unclassified information that you just can't post online. But I'm still not sure. I know there was an F-15 one, which I still haven't looked at.
Yeah,
And then there's.
I was going to report on it, but I don't think it happens that much, and no one cares now.
Well, no, it's like 3 minutes. Honestly, the Su-57 one might be worth reporting on because no major publications have picked it up yet, and it is amazing. It turns out that the Typhoon has a better RCS layout than the Su-57. That's not even a joke. Per these internal documents, it legitimately, the Typhoon is more stealthy than the Su-57.
Yeah, maybe I will pick that one up.
But you guys, because you could looks like a stealth fighter, right? So therefore, it is.
Yeah, no. I mean, you could legitimately just title it as, leaked Russian documents show, Su-57 less stealthy than Typhoon. Because you can use publicly available Typhoon RCS data, because it's not like they designed it to be a stealth fighter or anything. So there's at least an idea of how stealthy it is.
And on that bombshell. And on that bombshell, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Osint Bunker podcast. This is season 5. It is 2023. We are back with pretty much the whole team. Myself, Osinttechnical, George Allison from the UK Defence Journal, and obviously Austin. And we are back for season 5, and hopefully we've got some interesting episodes coming up. I apologise for however much of the introduction that Technical decides to leave in. He doesn't realise I've been recording for the last 3 minutes, so while I am genuinely all sorts of stuff, including home security cameras and whatever else.
I am genuinely too lazy to cut a lot of stuff, so
so most of the first 2 or 3 minutes, you guys are probably going to be listening and thinking, "What on earth is going on there?" But yeah, welcome back, guys. I trust you all had some sort of rest over the Christmas break, and I think it's fair to say we are going to start tonight where we left off and jump straight into Ukraine and the great tank debate.
Oh man, I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot pole. Someone else messed with the European politics, because honestly, it's become such a charged situation, and anytime you hear German nationalists getting angry, you kind of take a step back and get really scared.
Gosh, the news this morning was that Germany isn't blocking the export of Leopard tanks, but digging deeper into that, I think it's because no one's asking. It put me in mind of the UK weapon flights to Ukraine just before the start of the war, where they weren't overflying Germany. Now, the gist of everything at the time was Germany wasn't asked, but a lot of people didn't realise Germany wasn't asked because it was understood that they'd say no. And I think it's probably the same with the tanks just now, although they do say they aren't blocking it. But
yeah, I mean, so a lot of the arguments that I've seen for, again, a lot is based on hearsay at the moment. Which is, just not a great source of information because it's hearsay. But sometimes it's best to take kind of the logical path and say Poland has already given Ukraine an absolutely massive amount of, supplies so far, including, fairly modern systems like the AHS Crab, which is, their frontline, artillery system. And I don't see why the Poles would internally block something like that. I mean, they might. I just don't know why they would if they've already, given those donated units. And of course people will say just because the Polish government hasn't put in a request yet, they're internally blocking the transfers. But I don't think that's the entire truth, and I think a lot of that is sort of happening behind closed doors. And anyone who acts like they know everything that's happening is probably not being completely honest. Or maybe exaggerating what they know or what they can understand.
Yeah, I would say these are the kind of diplomatic conversations that play well into folks trying to, build a narrative. And I think we've kind of been here before with the debacle over the MiG-29s in April and May of last year, where you had, certain members of certain governments saying things that they probably shouldn't have been saying publicly, and that kind of leading to a breakdown of negotiations in the background. Right. And where we've gotten to on this tank debate now is it's gotten to the point where there's been so much sort of public discourse from public officials from various countries, whether it's the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, France, the UK, that it's starting to become sort of politically beneficial to certain actors to continue to bring it up and attempt to apply political pressure. The problem is that because a lot of these actual negotiations are happening in the back door, there isn't a lot of data to sort of pull up with it, and it ends up kind of driving down into a he said, she said moment, or what you would describe as your average argument at your local playground, where someone's like, yeah, I did that, and the other person's like, nuh-uh, and there's not much beyond that going on.
Yeah, and again, I think most of the people commenting on the situation right now just don't know. Like, it's just they don't have a solid idea of what's actually happening. And I think there is a lot probably going on in the background. Like, it does seem like the Germans would like any donation of Leopard tanks to be larger than, just a small one. And that they're also they appear to be pushing for the US to donate Abrams as well, which is a whole other can of worms. That isn't as simple as just like give tank to Ukraine. At least more so than something like Leopard. But I do think it is a highly complex situation that some people are trying to distill down to get basically your standard European squabbling that's been happening for the past I don't know 2,000 years or more. Like it's not new. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has read the joint statement on the Talon pledge. It was oh gosh, it was released a couple of days ago and updated today, but it's really heavy on this idea that Poland, the UK, and other European nations are looking to establish a sort of wider coalition of Leopard tank donors. So Poland is ready to donate a company of Leopard 2 tanks with 1,000 pieces of ammunition, pending a wider coalition of Leopard 2 tank donors being established.
Yeah, that seemed to be one of the elements that Poland wanted a wider coalition. Yeah. And it does seem like a few states have kind of jumped onto that. But I think the problem with that coalition is that short of like Germany joining it, it wouldn't be exactly a wide coalition for at least the supply of Leopards. And I think one of the internal problems right now is that Germany really doesn't have that many Leopards. They have a lot of Leopards on paper. Yeah. In practice, they don't have a lot of working Leopards, and so any German donation of Leopards would really sort of cut into the available stocks of what they have available for units. And I don't think they're prepared to do what the UK has done, which is just, sort of the damn the torpedoes we're giving them, Ukraine's getting the systems, even if it sort of drains our own internal capabilities.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
For the UK, it comes at an interesting time because obviously the most recent defence review, the decision was that the actual Challenger battle tank fleet would be reduced in size, and the reduced number would then be the only frames that would be upgraded to Challenger 3 variant. So the fact that we've obviously, I'm assuming it's going to be some of the Challenger 2s that we're not planning to keep and upgrade are the ones that we're now sending to Ukraine. And I think we've committed to 14 of the type to be sent to Ukraine. It comes as it's obviously an interesting move, and perhaps there's a sort of thought process in the MOD that if we're getting rid of some of the tanks anyway as part of the defence review, then why not give them to someone else who can make use of them? Whether that means that we'll end up seeing more Challenger 2s being handed over to Ukraine, or whether, as Prime Minister Sunak has turned around and said recently, we end up reviewing the reduction in the size of the British fleet and end up perhaps keeping a few more than we originally intended to, and then whatever we still decide not to keep potentially then gets handed over as a sort of second batch to Ukraine. I guess.
I mean, I'm
to be
just.
seen.
Yeah, I was just looking at the AS-90 deployment, which was a significant portion of the UK's actual AS-90 fleet. I think what percentage of like the active AS-90 squadrons was it? Like 40%?
Yeah, I think I had about 35-40%.
Yeah, which is just very surprising. I mean, I think the UK has how many AS-90s in service? Like 100 maybe right now.
And we've
and
promised
sending
30, haven't we?
Yeah, 30, and that's going to be the ones that are at the highest states of readiness in practicality, because that's kind of how it works. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to see those sort of be sent in that way. Though I mean, you look at how Poland has what Poland's done with their supply of AHS crabs, which are just an incredibly interesting system. That's a Korean howitzer, chassis with a AS-90 turret and a French gun. But they donated 18 out of the 80 they had, so a similar ratio to what the UK is doing now. Though, granted, the crabs that the Poles procured were a bit newer. I don't think they actually started receiving them until like 2008, I think.
And interestingly, I've seen today that Estonia has turned round and pledged to hand over all of its 155mm howitzers, which I believe are the South Korean-made K9 Thunders. They've told Ukraine that you can have all of them. Now, from what I understand, Estonia ordered 36 in total, 12 of which they've ordered this month. And out of the sort of 24 they'd previously ordered, they've had 18 delivered so far. So I don't know if the plan is that they're going to hand over the 18 they've got and then just have the remaining 18 when those orders are delivered, or whether they're genuinely planning to hand over potentially more. But again, that's an entire national fleet of 155mm howitzers, which is quite a significant commitment.
As on top of that, Denmark are donating 19 of their Caesar 155mm artilleries, leaving Denmark without any sort of effective artillery system. It is quite the commitment.
There has been some speculation on the Danes themselves, though, that this is a move to sort of get rid of their Caesar systems in exchange for a potential new deal with the Swedes on replacing those with their own Archer systems.
Yeah, it seems like there is a lot of shuffling going around right now with, countries not just getting rid of their older systems anymore, but now getting rid of their current systems in order to push forward upgrades under current expanded defense spending, which a lot of European countries did authorize after the Russian invasion. But I do think that currently right now Germany is in this position where they have been put under pressure because other European nations are making proportionally very large sort of commitments of military supplies, and at least publicly Germany has been perceived as being slow to sort of put stuff forward to Ukraine. and also basically combine it with a lot of the PR facing stuff that Germany's run into with, gas supplies and, internal pro-Russian sentiment within their government, and sort of this historical stuff that's happened, especially with, all the Merkel statements that were made over the past 10 years that were, generously viewed as tepid on Russia. And if you sort of had a bit more of a look, could be construed as, pro-Russia in nature. I think that's definitely hurt them, and a lot of the current perception is that the Germans want to, maintain not neutrality per se, but it's the German reasonability of always being sort of stoic on an issue, and it's put them in a situation where it may not necessarily look good for them, which I do think causes trouble, whereas you would be able to at least put forward some additional resources and sort of silence some of the criticism, whereas they've been at least politically unable to do that, and so you'll see commentators naturally act defensive over those issues. And I
I
know I
think
spent like a bunch of time basically saying nothing there because I'm really not trying to make anyone angry, but like I do think Germany is in an untenable position politically right now, where they're going to have to at least push forward some donations, that are more substantive, or they're going to face more political pushback within Europe.
And I would say both the Germans and the Poles politically find themselves in awkward situations around this. On the Polish side of things, right, you have this idea of building around, a coalition of the willing to donate more Leopard tanks. But, of the countries that have been more warm to that issue, either they don't, currently use Leopard tanks, like the Netherlands, who sold, I believe, all of theirs, or they have them in such sort of small supply that even if they really did sign on, you wouldn't see a large sort of donation. I mean, if the Danes tomorrow said, "Yeah, we're all in with Poland, we're going to send as many Leopards as possible,"
Well,
um,
it is interesting because the Netherlands did sell off all of their Leopards, but then they also went and they're now funding without, they're funding the upgrades to T-72s, to send to Ukraine. So it's sure they're not physically providing the supplies, but they're providing a lot of the necessary funding for a somewhat novel program that in effect sort of replaces what they would have done already.
for sure. But I think what Poland wants is they want somebody in that coalition that's not just themselves who has a significant amount of leopards. And the only real countries that could do that would be either the Germans themselves, the Turks, or the Greeks. And on the latter two, we really haven't heard much at all from them.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think either is going to give up leopards until the other one does in that situation. So
For sure.
I do think that is, but I do think there also is the element of sort of supply and long-term support that I don't think the Poles want to be singularly saddled with maintaining a Ukrainian Leopard fleet. Whereas if they were able to rope in, say, Germany, who has some of the resources necessary to maintain that long-term support, then I think they would be far more comfortable with those donations.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. And then I would also say, in regards to the German stance on this, I think you brought up a really salient point earlier, regarding just how much of the German tank fleet is capable of being shipped quickly, and being sustained in the short term. And I
Not
think
much of it.
no, not much. And I think the Germans want to, hide that fact for as long as possible. I mean, obviously, it's very bad PR to talk all about, as we talked about previously with the Merkel administration and everything like this. There's been to many the common observer, there's always been this idea that, the German economy and the German military are both powerhouses. for as much fire as the German government is under fire now, even if they signed off tomorrow and we're like, yeah, we're sending the Leopards, and then everyone looks at the numbers and they're like, the best we can do is 20. That's a bit of a PR defeat for Germany.
Hmm. And I think what you said, particularly about Turkey as well, obviously Turkey is causing its own problems in NATO at the minute by effectively refusing to allow the likes of Sweden and Denmark to, join. We've obviously seen another statement from Turkey's President Erdogan today, basically saying he's not going to let Sweden join NATO because of, I think it was a Danish politician set fire to a Quran in Stockholm or something.
Oh God, not that guy again.
And you just think like, I mean, seriously, I don't get me wrong. I understand that obviously, Turkey is a majority Muslim country, and so something like that is quite offensive to them. But in the grand scheme of things, it does strike me as just he's coming up with any excuse he can now, just to try and be as much of a thorn in NATO's side as he can. We've obviously all of last year.
No. That's not what the current thing. I mean, he's maneuvering around. He's maneuvering around upcoming elections, which is the. I mean, he's trying to rally a fairly diverse group of nationalists, which I know kind of seems, counterintuitive as a term, but I do think that there may be a change in tone after the elections in Turkey, because Erdogan's out for Erdogan. That's I don't think there's really a difference from that one.
Erdogan being out for Erdogan is absolutely correct there. And I would say the second point on top of the upcoming elections in Turkey would be the current sort of hoopla being thrown around about the F-16 deal to Turkey. And as much as Erdogan will be focusing a lot on things that are directly relevant to internal Turkish politics, what's been very clear since it was first announced that Sweden and Finland were seeking membership in NATO is that, Turkey wants its piece of the pie here. And in order for them to take that back, for Erdogan to take it back home and declare it as a win, he wants to get his piece of the pie. He wants to see these concessions being made on groups that he deems to be, terror groups operating within Turkey, as well as to see consistency in the arms deals that he's making with the West on higher end platforms.
Yeah, it's always hard to sort of, parse a lot of those internal political things, though, because a lot of it is either steeped in a lot of nuance that foreigners like us sort of have trouble understanding. And also I think there are, elements that I think we won't I don't think we won't understand them until after they happen. And there's going to be that element of it. I usually tiptoe around these issues because they are much harder to quantify than some of the other stuff. It is very hard to actually, point to discrete numbers and facts and figures and just like, yeah, here's what, here's the feels of the situation, because that's politics in a nutshell. I mean, I have a degree in political science. Like, polling is all a lie. It's all feels. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what a lot of these things are. They're relationship based as well. And so it is very hard to gauge as an outsider.
For sure. But what we have seen is we've seen Turkey's capability and willingness to take out displeasure with one sector of its foreign policy on a completely different one if it means they'll get more leverage in that primary one. So in the last couple of weeks, we've seen them be very ticked off about the potential F-35 deal with Greece, as well as, their own F-16 deal possibly going under. And so I think when we look at their application of pressure on other NATO states or on NATO as a whole, we could kind of draw a line at how that's how they're expressing their displeasure in order to sort of get their way moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I do think, again, a lot of those Eastern Mediterranean issues are continually issues per se. There is a lot that sort of, gets sort of batted back and forth there that does affect a lot of Eastern flank NATO stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, I definitely think, at least personally, it's a wait and see moment. I don't know what we're gonna see until then. Does anyone want to stop talking about the political side of things? Because I don't think we're gonna get anywhere
I was
there.
going to say, we'll drag it back to tanks for a minute, and there was one tank delivery to Ukraine which kind of took me by surprise, and I don't know if we've mentioned it previously, but Morocco donated 20 T-72s, which were then upgraded by the Czech Republic before delivery to Ukraine.
And wait, I believe the funds for the upgrades came from the Netherlands for that one?
Yeah.
Or yeah, it was
And
definitely.
I believe those tanks are actually out on the street in Ukraine now, as we speak, engaging Russian forces, or at the very least ready to engage Russian forces. I think there was a photo someone sent me earlier today from Bakhmut of one of those T-72s parked up outside a building somewhere. But yeah, Morocco, of all places.
We know when the
Yeah,
channels
no,
on
I mean
that?
it's definitely interesting to see those go through that process. But yeah, I mean, it's. I know Morocco purchased a bunch of T-72s back in the 90s and early 2000s, but it's always been interesting to sort of see Morocco's kind of pro NATO stance, and also I mean it's helped in some way by Algeria being a very friendly to Russia power. And so I do believe there's also the element of Morocco. There's kind of that sort of anti-Algerian sentiment, and also that scoring some brownie points with NATO, which I'm assuming they have done at this point, with a donation like this.
That's fair, and I think it also kind of shows the ingenuity of countries like the Dutch and the Czechs to be able to get that program rolling much quicker than some of these larger deals we've talked about previously.
Yeah, so Excalibur, the company that did it is Excalibur Armor Workshops. They are an extremely interesting company that has, I mean, it produces and works on a number of different systems. They also come out with sort of novel systems that they've worked on, and developed. They're definitely sort of an interesting asset that the Czechs have, because they have built a bunch of very novel systems. They have done a bunch of novel upgrade packages to systems, and they definitely are one of those advanced sort of they're very advanced in what they're able to do, and sort of put forward, especially in turnaround times on things. It's definitely super interesting that they have that market. I know. I'll put this down in the comments below, but they actually they have a wonderful advertising package of various upgrade packages and advanced sort of systems they've managed to integrate into older T-72 and T-55s, I think. But I do think the most interesting one, which I'm sure at some point they'll send to Ukraine, which is the T-72 Scarab, which is a significant upgrade to the T-72, effectively. I mean, turning it into a fairly advanced system. Which is, it's just definitely interesting to see how much they've done with that.
Do we know when the Challenger tanks are going to get to Ukraine eventually?
Ugh, no idea. Some countries announce it after things start to arrive, which I do think that or at least significantly after they've actually started the process of delivery. I do think we saw that, at least with some of the U.S. donated things like HARMS. I believe that the HARMS had been pretty active in use in Ukraine, even before the announcement was, or the donation was announced. I know, at least with Bradley's, between the first day they were announced as being delivered and the actual Ukrainian units like training on them, it was just a few days. And with some of the domestic UK training programs, I know there was the announcement of training starting domestically within the UK, and then it was mere days until the first before the first Ukrainian troops were on the ground at training grounds in the UK. So I do think that that's an element of this of were they announced before everyone was ready to get going with them, or was it after? I think we've yet to see that, but we probably will soon. I'm assuming they'll come at some point in the near future.
Yeah. I mean, with the Sea King helicopters, I was actually quite surprised to see them in action already. I had no idea the UK had Sea King helicopters lying around, but
yeah, I mean, the fact that they got them up and running within a month was pretty darn impressive. Because I think the donations were announced in late December, and they're already flying in Ukraine.
And bearing in mind, we retired the Sea Kings from even the search and rescue role a couple of years ago now, because obviously the UK search and rescue capability was Navy operated Sea Kings for a significant number of years, and famously they had the grey and orange colour scheme, for which they were very, very well remembered and very well liked. And then obviously that entire job was handed over to a private firm on a contract when the Navy retired the Sea Kings from that role. I for one didn't actually know we'd kept any of the Sea Kings. I know some of them had been shipped off to museums, and I think there was one famously bought by a private company or a private investor or something who converted it into sort of a little home in a field somewhere.
I think these actually are the search and rescue variants. I don't think they're the old battlefield.
Yeah, they do seem to be, and they seem to be used in a CSAR role, which is always interesting.
Yeah.
I will say it's definitely. I mean, I'm sure the Ukrainians will figure out how to bolt weaponry to them because it's only a matter of time at this point. But it is really interesting to see sort of the bouncing around, at least, and the or at least the I don't know the right term for this because I don't want to say anything weird, but I definitely do think the Ukrainians have been able to integrate a lot of these, at some point, because the Sea King is becoming literally a museum piece. But they've been able to integrate these older platforms into still doing something, to either, relieve other frontline platforms that would be, tasked to a CSAR role, or a transport role to, let them be able to conduct strike missions or whatever. Any MI8s that the Sea Kings free up from doing those actual roles is, that's an MI8 they're going to be putting on the front line. But I definitely think that these, even these older platforms, the Ukrainians have found use for them, and will probably continue to.
I'm sure the UK has an Airworthy Lancaster, maybe a Spitfire.
They'll figure out how to strap arms to them. They'll figure it out. Just wait. Sorry, which Vulcan is still in sort of flyable condition?
Oh, I'll tell you what.
Ukrainians are gonna figure out how to
You ever
strap
seen
harms
a?
to.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say, you ever seen a Vulcan launch a HARM missile? You will.
Yeah,
There are still Sea Harriers in somewhat serviceable use, if I'm right. I think the Sea Harrier FA2s are used to taxi around at Yeovil.
well, I think
I was
that a
going to say,
lot
I
of them
don't think
got
we've got that
sold
many
off.
of them left now. I'm pretty sure we
I've got-
sold most of the airframes to the Americans, didn't we?
That was the
No, those were
GR.
those are the
Yeah.
GR Harriers. No, some
Oh,
of the
those are the
Sea Harriers
GRs.
actually got bought. Well, they got bought for private use within the U.S. So yeah, I don't know. I saw a few for sale recently. For a fairly bargain basement price. It was like 9 million for 3 of them. And like all had fairly solid combat history, stretching back to the Falklands.
Yeah.
But it is sort of interesting to see how or where the Harriers have gone at this point.
Yeah, I do think it'd be quite amusing if we did decide to donate the Vulcan just to keep her flying a little bit longer. But I highly suspect that Zelensky would then probably try and use it to bomb somewhere deep inside Russia for a bit of
And you know
propaganda.
what? It'd probably work.
It probably
Well,
would, and that's the thing that scares me most, to be honest. If Russian air defences recently have been anything to go by, I reckon she'd probably stand a good chance of making it back.
Yeah, don't get me. Or no, I'll let you go ahead, George.
No, it's just funny that you should say that. I wrote an article today about the UK hasn't ruled out supplying longer range missiles to Ukraine in order to strike Russian targets, which I found it actually quite remarkable that while they haven't committed to doing it, and it's probably very unlikely they will, they specifically stated they hadn't ruled it out.
I mean, I don't think they're ever going to rule anything out
No.
categorically. I don't think that the UK will ever do that. I mean, the US has sometimes said that they will, won't provide longer range weapons in order to avoid provoking Russia. I think maybe that was the term used, or heightening the tension.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the parts of why the U.S. still won't give those very long range weapons. The U.S. I do not believe in any near point in time will give Ukraine full range, and I'll say this, fully equipped or full range ATACMS. Or ATACMS, whichever you want to call it. I don't think they'll do that yet.
So
There is a chance, there are other, ATACMS that have a shorter range that, might be sort of utilized or at least attractive. But yeah, I don't think, and it's, it's that not giving things that will heighten any sort of tension at the strategic level.
No, that's fair enough. But what do you make of Russia installing SAMs on high buildings in Moscow?
I was about to pivot into that one.
Yeah, I'll let you go.
Without going into too many, just palace coup shenanigan, speculations, because that's everyone who does that probably doesn't know what they're talking about. But I do think that there is an element that the Russians are potentially afraid that their other longer range systems aren't as capable as they thought they were at defeating targets like small drones and other stuff. So deploying a combat proven system like the Pantsir, it would be a pretty effective platform against something like a small drone attack carried out against Moscow. And they possibly do have that fear. And if you look at the way they're positioned around the Kremlin. They are positioned to protect the Kremlin.
And I think it's interesting because it's almost as though the Kremlin is now expecting some sort of Ukrainian version of the Doolittle raid against Moscow, and obviously the propaganda element would be, again, sort of the main focus of that.
I think it's also indicative of a creeping sense of sort of paranoia within Russian high command and within the Russian government itself, right? On the one end, the United States has been very clear that, we have not and we don't have any plans currently to supply some of those longer range missile systems to the Ukrainians. However, the Russians have seen us also say, we're not going to send Bradleys, and then we do, or we're not going to send this, and we're not going to, the most recent big ticket item, which will take some time to deploy, is the Patriot system. And so I think the Pantsers themselves, I would agree with what Technical was saying. I think they're there more so out of fear of a more insurgent-looking action against, key sites in Moscow, as opposed to a massive, the Vulcan finally making it to Moscow and wreaking havoc. Um, but in all seriousness, I also think that there is a suspicion and there's a fear that the U.S. or another Western ally would provide Ukraine with something to conduct a limited strike on a strategically important target in Russia.
Hmm.
And the propaganda, sort of the PR defeat that would be incurred by the Russians by not being set up to combat that, would wreak havoc on their already waning morale.
Yeah, and speaking of morale and sort of the views of senior leadership in the Kremlin and Russian military, I noticed recently, I can't remember if it was after one of Putin's speeches or something else, the tone in Russian state media changed somewhat from what used to be them discussing the special military operation, and they've actually almost ceased referring to it as a special military operation now. They seem to be instead referring to it, particularly in the media, as a war. Obviously, for those of our listeners who follow the Darth Putin account on Twitter, which is probably one of the better spoof accounts out there, and usually comes out with some quite outlandish and funny tweets. The ongoing joke from that account has been, it's day 300 and whatever of my 3-day war. My troops are advancing in a backwards direction, and I remain a master strategist. And to a certain extent, it is starting to look like even sort of Russian leadership are having now to admit that this isn't quite what they had in mind when they started the offensive a year ago.
Oh, absolutely. And the initial sort of reference to it as a special military operation, which is now very much shown to be a double-edged sword to Russian information efforts. Um, I think it's a really clear example of a gamble, right? Had that initial strategy played out and had they continued to call it a special military operation, then, the Russians look like geniuses.
Hmm.
But, the longer, what are we on, day 300 and something of the 3-day special military operation,
Yeah.
the longer they continue to refer to it as such, the more it makes that line look inept and out of touch. So I think there's a
Yeah.
very clear reason why we've seen Russian state media outlets, as well as Russian propagandists, try and slowly start distancing themselves from that line, because they don't really have the events on the ground to back it up. And in October of last year, we started seeing a lot more of the conversation switching to, oh, this is a conflict against terrorism. Now we're seeing some more narratives coming up about other unrelated conflicts such as Serbia, unrelated directly to Ukraine is what I mean by that. But what's very clear is that the Russian information sector was not prepared to continue to justify something like this for this long. And as a result, they're really having to try and scramble to get their story straight.
Oh yeah, no, they're suffering in their attempts to sort of keep together the narrative. I mean, if you look at the average Russian Telegram channel, they are there is, even among the most hardcore of pro regime accounts, there is this understanding that it's a war. and they won't say it, openly. They'll still use the words, zone of the special military operation, and all this other stuff, but there is that underlying understanding of basically any account that isn't, just a stream of Russian, just straight Russian media releases, that there is that understanding that this is a war, this is what's happening. But no, it is really interesting to sort of see that evolve. And I do think it has evolved to this point where they cannot openly admit, because it would be disastrous if they did, or at least would get that type of egg on your face that is more internally harmful than anything else, than just keeping the lie up. But I definitely think that there is the general understanding among the average Russian that it is a war. I do not think the Russians were ever able to exert that much informational control over their people. And even if you look at the Russian state media outlets, they do not paint a pretty picture for the overall Russian war efforts. Though they will trumpet, if there is a minor Russian victory, they will absolutely trumpet that from the heavens. But they also sometimes have to admit when things have gone south for them. And I don't think that will change anytime in the near future.
And what we've seen in the last, month or so has been a tremendous amount of pivoting from state media outlets, just really trying to find something that'll stick. And what they've kind of ended up on in the last week or so has been an intense focus on what's going on near Soledar, as well as continuing to sort of trump up the quote unquote accomplishments of the Wagner group. In the weeks before that, we saw two narratives trying to sort of stick that really weren't. The first being the prisoner exchange with the U.S. Between Brittany Griner and Victor Bout. That kind of fell flat on its face when Bout got back to Russia and was talking about how he didn't want to go fight in the war, or he wouldn't be enlisting immediately. And then the second narrative was all of the talk about a potential ceasefire for Orthodox Christmas. And again, I mean, there was never any ceasefire agreed to by either side there, but obviously that was a sort of a blatant attempt by the Russians to say, look at the Ukrainians, look at how they're violating this ceasefire that hasn't really existed, but they're the bad guys. And that really didn't catch on either. So now we've seen a large scale focus on Bakhmut, Soledar, and a semi-consistent focus. And I'd like to hear your guys' inputs on this as well. I think one of the ways the Russians are trying to downplay the actual effects of the war on, conscripted troops and further mobilization efforts is by focusing on Wagner itself, because when they focus on Wagner, it looks, number one, it's a specific unit they can look at and say, look at how well they're performing. This is what Russian military superiority looks like on the positive end. And then on the negative end, they can downplay any difficulties they're running into because they can describe them as a private military company, right? These aren't, when you're talking to the Russian populace, you're not saying, these are your sons who were conscripted. These are all volunteers. They want to be here.
Yeah, so I think the problem with Wagner, at least, as this group, is that the more they pump it up, the more that it actually becomes a threat to the Russian government itself. They're currently, Wagner is the only successful portion of the Russian military, mostly because they can just throw their quote volunteers at Ukrainian positions and just sort of erode them with the sheer amount of people they're willing to sacrifice. But they've been successful with sort of that model of basically throw prisoners at the front lines and hope for the best. I do think that Russia is in the, or at least the Russian government, or currently the Russian military command of Gerasimov and everyone around him, or as they continue to reshuffle stuff, who knows who will actually end up in power there. But I think the potential risk, at least to the Russian government per se, is that they're, if they hype Wagner up to the public will see them as a more and more effective organization, whereas they will view the Russian army as incompetent. And so you sort of, you see where the logical end to this is it undermines the power of the government to the people. And again, Russia doesn't have the levels of informational control where they can just sort of discount um, practical issues that are happening. So you end up with these risks where if they hype up um, these basically private militant organizations, there's a huge risk for the Russian government itself, especially now that the leader of Wagner, Prigozhin, is kind of having a feud with the military leadership in Russia. Um, and so if that continues, the Russian government, it's really hard to publicize Wagner's successes and their own failures.
Yeah, no,
That's
that
no,
makes
go ahead.
it makes a bunch of sense, and I definitely would agree with that. The more Wagner is lauded, the more dangerous they become to, the trust of the Russian public within the Russian military, or for the Russian military, I should say. Yeah, no disagreements there.
Yeah, because the average Russian, looks at the situation and they see an incompetent regular army, a non-existent air force, where air defense and all of that stuff. Um, but I do think that especially if the Ukrainians are able to put together another offensive in, basically any area that Wagner doesn't have a heavy presence in. So, basically not Bakhmut or the surrounding area. Um, I definitely think that there will be a lot of internal Russian drama there, over the actual effectiveness of the army itself. And then of course there's the 500-pound Russian bear in the corner of what is the army doing right now with all their conscripts? Are they planning another, winter or spring offensive at this point? Though I don't think it's actually gotten cold enough yet this winter where they're probably going to run into mud again sometime soon. Um, and I definitely think there is that debate on what the Russians are actually going to do in the upcoming months. Because, I mean, yeah, sure, Wagner was able to advance a couple of kilometers in Soledar and take that town. And there's going to be back and forth in that area for a while. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really change the tactical situation at all. Both in Donetsk, in the east, and among on the greater Ukrainian front. So there, I I I'm still questioning what the Russians intend to do in the spring. And I think a lot of people are at the moment.
I think that's a very valid thing to speculate on if capable, or just sort of wait for more information on. Because, like you mentioned, a lot of what we've seen in Soledar and in Bakhmut, at least from the Russian side of things, has been, a lot of focused on Wagner. And we haven't heard a ton about, the recent mobilizations, where those troops are going, what state they're in. I mean, there's been some limited, information. I think that the consistent rumor that's been going on for the last 6 months has always been, what Belarus doing.
Hmm.
And so,
I mean, short of conscription, the Belarusian military is a non sort of power in the situation.
oh, for sure. Um, and the reality is, if Belarus did get directly involved, they'd be facing far greater risks within their own cities, as opposed to them attempting and likely, if not certainly, failing to open up another front threatening Kyiv.
Yeah, I don't think they could pull off conscription and then sending most of their regular military away. They kind of need them to hang around for internal issues.
Hmm. And I think, unless you guys have got anything else you want to add to that, we will probably call it there.
You want to do news, John? I know Ukraine for me is news for you.
I mean, there's not an awful lot of news really that we haven't already covered that would really be relevant for this episode. So
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not. I mean, of course, I really haven't been keeping up with the news recently due to, some other stuff. But yeah, no, I haven't seen anything that really like comes out at me news-wise. Oh shoot, the one other thing. Ah, crud, that the New York Times story. Russian agents in Spain. Um, so this was a story from the New York Times released yesterday. Um, Russian agents were suspected of directing far-right groups to send mail bombs in Spain. Um,
oh
so this is coming from U.S. and EU officials. Last November and early December, 6 letter bombs
yeah,
were
I do
sent
remember
to,
this now.
yeah, the country's prime minister, the American and Ukrainian embassies, the Spanish Defense Ministry, and I believe also a Spanish weapons manufacturer.
Mm.
But an employee at the Ukrainian embassy was injured in when one of the packages actually exploded. It's like this was a legitimate act of terror. Um, and now U.S., EU, and U.S. officials believe that Russian military intelligence officials were responsible for directing the attacks. And so I think there definitely is a huge question here of how far is Russia willing to go with stuff like this? Are they willing to start asymmetric warfare within Europe? Are because Russia since the 1950s has sort of cultivated a lot of these organizations within Europe, and put a lot of work towards maintaining those contacts even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Um, so that is a huge question and a huge risk assessment question for Europe right now of, will these organizations sort of pose a threat on Russia's order? And, if Russian officials, order an attack like this through a proxy group, what type of sort of action do you consider that as? How does Europe respond to something like that?
And it's going to be a key question for Europe, particularly you obviously mentioned it is effectively an act of terrorism, because it's fair to say that in recent years, Europe has collectively very much shied away from using the term terrorism for a number of incidents that have taken place. We've obviously seen incidents recently in Germany where sort of there's been very clear sort of shootings, stabbings, even sort of like vehicles being used in attacks. Obviously, this is more generally terrorism related, and the sort
Yeah,
of been a deliberate shying away from declaring them as terrorist incidents.
I think there was the element of shying away from it because they were either lone wolf or inspired attacks, whereas this is organized. This is
Yeah.
this is this is an official thing. This is state sponsored terror.
Yes. Yeah.
Which it's certainly difficult to parse events like that. And sort of tracking and nailing that down is a challenge, and one that I think European states are running into right now.
Yeah.
Because holy cow, I'm like if you look at this in a vacuum, it is a state in that views itself as in a state of war with the European Union and with the Europe in general, and this state views, or the state has now directed terror attacks against these parties that they believe that they're in war against, that they believe that they're at war against. And how does Europe sort of parse that, and how do they prepare for the next one? Because if they've done it once, then who knows what they'll do next.
Yeah, I think it's a very clear indicator that there is an appetite within the Russian intelligence community to promote sort of acts of physical violence, political, sorry, well, I guess political and physical violence within the borders of the European Union. The only question that I have, and I'm sure plenty of European intelligence and defense planners have, is will this, number one, continue after they've been kind of caught red-handed doing so? And then two, if it does continue, will this expand into sectors that Russia has previously threatened, like energy storage? Um, so
Because
those
and I think they did send a mail bomb to a weapons manufacturer who is sending weapons to Ukraine. And so that's not just going from just a political act of terror, but it's direct action against enemy war infrastructure.
Yeah. And of course, this isn't something that's new just because of the special military operation in Ukraine, because of course it's not been that many years since we obviously had the Russian agents in the UK in Salisbury. Obviously, with the Novichok poisonings, that was quite a big deal at the time. And as you say, clearly Russia is still continuing to use its intelligence services for that purpose. And I suppose my thought is, well, obviously they've done that. Now they've sort of, as you say, targeted both political and military infrastructure in Spain. How much further are they prepared to go?
Yeah, and who are they willing to target as well? Would they target Polish entities? Would they target French entities? Would they target, entities in the UK or Germany? Um, and there definitely, I think, remains those really big questions that no one has an answer to. And I think that's scary for a lot of people right now.
For sure, and it's coming, and it's kind of coming off of the tail of yet another Russian narrative kind of falling flat on its face, which was, I'm sure we all remember over last summer, the just absolute gargantuan amount of information being put out on how Europe would freeze this winter and how, Europeans, whether they're in Germany or Italy or France, wouldn't be able to turn on their stoves. And we saw, many a Kremlin-funded propagandist, filming themselves just turning on their stove or something like that. And as a result, we've seen what's been fundamentally a gargantuan effort on the part of the Europeans to properly store energy stockpiles necessary come to really, really good fruition. I mean, the current German liquid natural gas stockpiles are beating the most optimistic of their own predictions. So, keeping everything that we've just talked about in mind, I don't see it as a far reach to at least consider the possibility of sort of Russian intelligence-backed terror targeting European infrastructure sites.
Yeah, and I it's definitely something that European leadership will have to parse. They will have to, assess the safety risks. And I definitely think it's really hard to figure that out. And it's dangerous. I mean, it's attacks against assets, especially once you sort of fully understand the attack against a defense manufacturer. It is a tax against defense capabilities.
Yeah.
Which certainly starts becoming or looking more and more like direct action by the Russian military more than anything.
And of course,
And it's not just
the fine line then becomes how far Russia goes towards direct action, as you say, and how far down the scale in the opposite direction NATO then considers Article 5 as having been reached.
and that is the truly dangerous part of, would a major attack against an asset, in NATO, would that classify as an Article 5 event if they were able to draw direct connections to Russian intelligence? And I think that is, I mean, even with Spain, it's an attack against a defense, asset, possibly directed, by Russian intelligence. At what level would Spain, be justified in calling some sort of Article 4, or is it Article 3 or Article 4? It's the conference to discuss, Article 5.
Four.
At what point would they be willing to, enact Article 4 on an issue like this? I don't think they have yet, and I probably don't think they would on something like this. But, if Russia is able to get away with something like this, will they repeat it? And against whom?
On a slightly related tangent, you guys have probably seen the news that there are currently 2 former Royal Navy mine hunters sailing under the Ukrainian flag with Ukrainian crew, operating off the eastern coast of Scotland. Now, do we think Russia might take any sort of action against those ships? Is it possible?
Do they have the capabilities to?
Oh, yeah, that's
I'm fairly sure if they were to do something, it would be very clear that they did it, if they could even do it. That's a huge question.
That was more my thinking. Do they think they would get away with it? Now, there have been a lot of operations from British P-8 Poseidons, more or less exactly in the area those 2 Ukrainian ships are operating, but it's always struck me as something that I think would be an easy propaganda win for Russia. Obviously, they don't really have the technical capabilities to do it, but
they'd have the technical capabilities to do it, but everyone would know that they did it.
Yeah.
And not just know that they did it, but it would also be very. It would be hard for them to do it.
I think we will call it
On that cheery note.
Yeah, exactly. Terrorism and Russian sinking ships in the North Sea. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Season 5, Episode 1 of the Osint Bunker podcast. Thank you to Austin, George and Technical for joining me this evening. We are hoping to start having guests back on the podcast, hopefully from next episode. So do keep an eye out on our Twitter and Facebook in relation to those announcements. And thank you all very much for listening. Good night.